welcome back everyone to Have You Heard, the podcast around social media stuff. I'm joined today by probably a new face that you guys haven't seen before. So this is Lewis. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Lewis. I'm a senior paid media manager. I've been here for maybe 6 months, something like that. Worked with Joey before, some other places. But yeah, excited to be here.
Cool. And I guess for those guys who haven't seen myself before, I'm Joey. I'm paid media director here at Social Shepherd. We're both very on brand today. Lewis is wearing his Social Shepherd hoodie and I'm dressed like a sheep. So,
yeah,
here we are.
Yeah, I had that dilemma this morning. What do I dress up as?
What, for the podcast?
For the podcast.
There's always the vibe that we get told not to wear the same colour as the seats that we're sat on, otherwise we get told off. But we've both obviously missed that memo.
Yeah.
Anyway, on to what we're supposed to be talking about today, which is an interesting topic. It's going to be around forecasting or reading the future, as some people might call it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as glamorous as that, but yeah, definitely it is predicting the future.
Yeah. So I think quite a lot of the work that we do, obviously we're making decisions off the back of data that we've seen within ad accounts, optimizations, but I think what quite a few of our clients like to see, and part that aids kind of our, I guess, forward planning as well, is putting forecasts together based on what we've seen, in previous months, years, and looking forward of how we can build that out, how we can paint a picture of what we're expecting to see coming forward. And I think there's lots of challenges that we face while we do that. I think there's many different ways that people can forecast, but I think today we want to talk about kind of how we forecast, what we feel is the best way and best practice of forecasting. And then I think the common mistakes that people are making when they are forecasting.
Sure.
So Lou, do you want to kick things off around what we mean by forecasting?
Yeah. So I guess forecasting is, it's not as mystical as you made it sound, trying to predict the future, but it's definitely trying to get a rough idea of what's going to happen when we're running sort of whatever it might be. So any channel, any sort of KPI, whatever it might be, we're trying to work out what that looks like in the future. And there are lots of different ways to do it, I guess, but the goal of forecasting is so there's no surprises. We don't all of a sudden get a result that we didn't expect, but we can also plan for, if we think it's going to be good, let's go for it, kind of thing. So I guess that's forecasting in a nutshell, but yeah. Yeah,
nice. I think and you mentioned a good point there around different platforms, because there are different ways of forecasting. And I think certainly when you're looking at it on a platform by platform basis, there's not like a one size fits all for all of those different platforms. So I guess that's probably a good starting point for us to kick things off with, is kind of how we forecast for each different platforms and kind of the differences, then things and different metrics that we're looking at when we are looking at, say, Google versus Meta.
Yeah. Wow, that's one hell of a question. I think to start with, we need to think about how that media is bought, and where that's being shown, and how people are interacting with that, and what each platform plays in that total journey to finally convert whatever that might be. So I think, when we're looking at like Meta, for example, obviously you're showing that in your feed, it's interrupting your feed, but you could be showing that lots and lots of times. Whereas if we're forecasting for something like Google or Bing, maybe not so much Bing, but for Google, definitely, we're looking at, when I'm actually there and I'm ready to purchase, or I'm ready to, look at a product or whatever that might be. So there's completely different sort of ways to go about it, because there are completely different sort of mindsets that your audience is going to have moving into that.
Yeah, for sure. I think the different attribution windows that we look at across each of those different channels plays a big part into it. And like we said, for each individual channel, there are going to be different ways that we forecast. Yeah. I think certainly, from a Google Ads perspective, certainly for search activity and shopping activity, what we're looking at is last click revenue that's being driven off the back of those ads. But certainly, again, when we're forecasting for the Meta side of things, it's very much more on that 7-day click, 1-day view attribution window. And, that being said, we do also do forecasting for last click revenue as well, because typically we will still have access to that historical data within Google Analytics to look at. So I think that's kind of the first challenge, is always kind of looking at, what attribution window are we looking at when we're kind of looking at pulling these numbers together. And like you said, understanding where the channel fits within a user's journey to dictate, which kind of path that you want to go down.
Yeah, and I think it's also being sort of quite conservative sometimes with your estimates, and in other times quite liberal. But yeah, obviously with platforms like Facebook, when they're bought on an impression basis, you can, in theory, you could spend millions and millions. But that just means that poor little me, who's trying to look for a product, gets shown an ad like a million times, and I don't want to see that, and the client doesn't want that either. So yeah, that's one of the main, I guess, differences between that and Google. Whereas like, Google, you can't really spend unless somebody's actually interested. So but yeah, keeping those two things in mind when you're looking at those.
So you mentioned a good point there around the different ways that media are bought. So Meta and actually all other paid social channels are all bought off a CPM basis. So for those who don't know what that means, that's a cost per 1,000 impressions. That's kind of how it's bidded for within the auction. Whereas Google is very much done off a CPC basis. You're bidding for the click essentially off the back end of that. And I think that's a really important factor to take into a point when we are looking at these forecasts, is understanding how these different metrics interact with each other. When you're trying to model that out, because I think typically the way that, we would look at doing it is, looking at we get it built out in a Google sheet, and then essentially we build out all the formulas. This sounds very boring. To essentially and see which metrics have a knock-on effect to other metrics. And then usually that CPM or CPC is a really good starting point for us to start benchmarking from. And I think that's the starting point for any forecasting, is really looking at the core metrics that you can benchmark based off your historical data, which I think typically you can look at a CPC and a CPM are always a really good starting point to go for. And then you can start building out from there, is start looking at your conversion rate. You can start looking at your click-through rate. You can start looking at all of these other metrics that you can then benchmark, based on what I guess we've seen from that point, and then start populating the rest of the sheet from that point.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point as well you made about historical data as well, because that gives you a really good sort of insight into seasonality and, what happened last March, or, whatever that might be, because that will give us a really good indication of how much we can spend whilst, being within our KPI, whatever that might be. But also, different things change. Did we have a promo running in March and maybe we run that again, or, something like that. So yeah, seasonality is really important, and being able to see that, there are plenty of tools available separate to your own data as well, which you can use to help with seasonality. Things like Google Trends, for example, can help you sort of like see maybe search volume's a bit higher in certain months, maybe it isn't, or maybe it's a little bit more expensive in the summer and maybe it isn't for these audiences and things like that. And you can start to put together a picture, I guess, of what your activity is going to look like throughout the year. And I think that's really important when we're looking at metrics, especially because just because it could be down in 1 month doesn't necessarily mean that it's anything that we forecasted. It could just be the market.
Yeah, exactly. And I think seasonality always plays a big part into it. And I think, again, that kind of leads into, I guess, a common mistake that people might make when they are kind of forecasting this activity is not just the seasonal trends that you're seeing. Let's just imagine an ice cream company, for example, quite clearly over the summer months, that's going to peak and be, in terms of like search term volume or demand, that's where the demand is going to be. But I think typically, again, the things you're then taking into consideration outside of that is promotions and the impact that that's got on your average order value, say, for example. So if you're then benchmarking that based off historical data, building that into your future forecasting and making sure that you've got full understanding of why that average order value might be lower because you're in promotion during certain months, and making sure that you're building that forward and taking it into account. Yeah,
and also the volume of data you're looking at to forecast from. Like, you can't forecast the whole year off of last month, because last month, it could be sunny, for example, or could have a promotion or something like that. So yeah, looking at a large amount of data and trying to work out the trends within that, as opposed to just saying, well, last month was good, I guess this month will be good, is definitely the right thing to do, because we don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, essentially.
Yeah, for sure. I think that actually leads us quite nicely back to another point that you said earlier around making sure that we're being quite liberal with the kind of numbers that we're putting together. I always think that, when we are putting these, future forecasts together, that we always give ourselves, maybe a bit of extra wiggle room. So looking back at the benchmarking point of view, let's just say between, January and February last year, your CPCs were, 35p on Google.
Yeah.
You don't want to exactly map that again for this year, because again, there might be fluctuations in the market in terms of how many competitors there are, which might cause a little bit of CPC inflation. So those are the things that we've then got to take into account and say, actually, we need to give ourselves a little bit more room around the numbers that we're putting within those kind of metric areas. Yeah. So I think in that point, then maybe we would put 40p as our forecasted CPC, and that gives us a bit of wiggle room based on what we think might happen going forward.
Yeah, and there's always room to improve. You can always improve, and you can always do better year over year, month over month, whatever that might be. But yeah, it's worth considering sort of market conditions and things like that. Some things are totally out of your control, like CPCs, for example. If taking your example of an ice cream company, if all of a sudden there were 3 other ice cream vans next to mine, then my CPC is going to go up. Although I don't know how many ice cream vans are using Google Ads, but the point still stands.
Cool. So I think, moving on from ice cream vans and comparing ice cream vans from each other, I think one of the main things as well is also just not to be scared about forecasting. At the end of the day, we are trying to attempt to read the future based off, what we know has happened, but we can't exactly predict what's going to happen. So I think certainly from like a client management perspective and certainly managing their expectations, that's always a really important part of how we're, building these forecasts and delivering them to clients, because it's very easy for, forecasts to be taken kind of as they are on paper. And then we kind of get marked against them almost. And just making sure that, the client understands this is our attempt at trying to read the future. We can do a relatively good job at trying to measure that based off what we've seen, but it's not always kind of on the point, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's also, how complex you look to forecast, depending on the client's kind of knowledge of all of the jargon around sort of paid media. And it should be something that should reassure you and the client, and it shouldn't be the other way around. It shouldn't be like a target or something looming over your head. It should be more, okay, well, we think this is possible. We've put a lot of thought into this. So let's get cracking, basically, instead of sitting there and being like, oh, I'm so worried I'm not going to hit my, 15 ice cream sales a month or whatever it might be. So yeah.
Yeah. So don't be scared of forecasting is the general crux of it. Well, I guess that ends our conversation around forecasting today. Thanks everyone for either watching or listening, and whatever platform you're on, please make sure you like, follow and subscribe. Thanks very much. See you soon.